Thank you again, Walter. Our next conversation will be with Paul Miller of Georgetown University and Sam Goldman of George Washington University, refereed by Drew Griffin, managing editor of Providence. So Paul and Sam, if you would come forward along with Drew. And importantly, for those of you who are wondering, refreshments will be available at 3 o'clock, so within view.
Okay, well, as Mark said, we've got Paul Miller here, professor of practice for international affairs at Georgetown University, Sam Goldman. To my immediate left, who's assistant professor at political science, executive director of the Loeb Institute of Religious Freedom. And Providence exists as a vehicle to equip the American mind to engage the real world. And one of the realities that we're confronted with and that we have to grapple with is the presence of religion, the influence of religion on culture and policy and foreign policy and global affairs, and that so often is overlooked in coverage of international affairs, coverage of national affairs. And so Providence exists to help fill that gap and have and host conversations like this as we as a country are kind of struggling to come to terms with our identity in a new age that's gripped by a lot of new and unique opportunities and new and unique struggles, and some old struggles as well, that we can equip the American mind to engage those struggles by acknowledging some of the realities that we have to face. So part of the conversation, part of today, and talking about God and America and nationalism, is to kind of have a discussion of what makes this nation, right? What makes an American? What makes an American citizen? And all the competing definitions that are out there. That there are far right that tend towards the more blood and soil ethnic definitions, and then there's the far left of where that, to paraphrase maybe George Bernard Shaw, that the golden rule, there is no golden rule, is American identity or citizenship. There is no real kind of American identity. It's just all a gathering together. So have this kind of conversation and talk really about the difference between creed, tribe, and or both. We've got Sam and Paul here. So I'll start with Sam and then kind of move to Paul, if that's fine, and probably talk maybe for 15 minutes, and then we'll engage some questions. And if you have questions as the audience, when we get towards the end, we'll have the roving mic for you. So Sam?
Well, thank you, Drew. And I have just one correction, which is that I was recently promoted, so I now identify as associate professor.
Okay, I'm sorry. No, let the record be corrected. That we are good.
But I also want to contest, in the spirit of discussion and provocation, I think the premise of the conversation, which is that there is just one conception of American national identity, or just one American nation. I've spent the last year looking into these issues, and my conclusion is that there are at least three, probably more, but three sort of basic symbols of American nationalism that have proved historically enduring. It's not an exhaustive list, but again, these are the sort of images that remain with us. And they overlap in certain respects, but they're also different. So I thought it might be worth describing my understanding of these three conceptions of American national identity and the relation between them. And the first, which is perhaps less familiar today, but has been particularly significant at specific periods. I think during the Civil Rights Movement, during the Civil War, and also during the Revolution, is America as a covenant. And this is a vision of American national identity that is really derived from the Puritan experience, which sees Americans as a nation constituted by two relationships, a horizontal one among the members, but also a vertical relationship between the community and God. And this is a conception of what a political and indeed a religious community is, which emerges largely from Calvinism, but through Calvinism it has roots in the Hebrew Bible. So it's a product of the kind of synthesis of Christian theology and Jewish texts that the sociologist Philip Gorski has described as the Mosaic moment, and which he and other scholars see as one of the points of origin for modern nationalism. The limitations of the understanding of America as a covenant, though, have to do with the specificity of that origin. So this is very largely a New England story, which was then nationalized with some, although not total success, by theologians and political figures in the end of the 18th century. It is closely associated with classical Calvinism, and as the influence of classical Calvinism waned in the 18th century, became linked with hierarchically organized denominations with links to the old mother country, to Britain. So in addition to the congregational churches in New England, many Episcopalians adopted this rhetoric. It's also not especially pluralistic. And one of the interesting things about reviewing some of this literature is that as you read these expressions of a covenantal vision of American nationality, and I'm thinking of writers like Timothy Dwight, who served ultimately as president of Yale College and wrote some incredibly awful, although very interesting epic poetry expressing his vision of America, is that it's geographically constrained. It's really an account of America with New England as its spiritual and intellectual heartland, and which presents America as a kind of New England writ large, which adapts what was best in the mother country and jettisons the rest. And this, even in the late 18th and early 19th century, just wasn't selling for most people. For reasons that Walter Mead just described, the political and social and religious reality of American life was simply too pluralistic to accommodate this vision. And as a result, it went mostly into eclipse in the early 19th century. And I think the last great expression of the covenantal vision was the Hartford Convention of 1814, which was organized by Federalist politicians in protest of the War of 1812. The Hartford Convention did not propose secession, as is sometimes charged. What it actually produced was a set of proposals to amend the Constitution and other basic institutional forms, but it serves as a kind of party platform for this covenantal vision, which revolves around a geographically constrained, ethnically homogeneous, religiously hierarchical American people. And it didn't sell then, and it's certainly not going to sell today. So even though elements of covenantal rhetoric have remained with us and are expressed in Lincoln's speeches, in some of King's oratory, I think the vision itself is no longer accessible. So what then replaced it? The second symbol of American national identity, I think, is the crucible or melting pot, as it's more familiarly known. And this, I think, is the least well understood, because when we think of the melting pot, we tend to think of the urban immigrant neighborhoods in big cities around the turn of the 20th century. And that's, of course, because of Israel Zangwill's famous play, The Melting Pot, which was praised by President Theodore Roosevelt, among others. But it's actually a much older image. I think it can be found as far back as the early 19th century. And it's also a much more pastoral image. It's really a rural image. When you see American writers talking about a sort of crucible of national identity, what they're usually describing is the emergence of a new American race and a distinct American culture, not in the cities, but actually in the West. Theodore Roosevelt makes a version of this argument in The Winning of the West. And here the claim is not that America is a continuation and purification of what was best in England, but that something entirely new is going to emerge through a kind of providential mixing of ethnic and religious and cultural strands. And I use the word providence advisedly because if the covenantal conception of American identity was associated with Calvinism, this vision is very closely associated with the kind of post-millennial enthusiastic Protestantism that emerges from the Second Great Awakening. But this understanding, too, faces a crisis. To some extent in the Civil War, which made it much harder to be an unqualified optimist about the American future, but also as a result of the so-called new immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe that began in the 1870s and intensified for the next few decades. The Crucible had been a compelling image for many Americans so long as they felt that the new strains or new races, as they called them, being added to America. And I should say that race, as it was used in the early 19th century, was similar to what we would now call nationality or ethnicity. It didn't have the biological characteristic that became associated with race after the Civil War. That was okay so long as they felt akin to these newcomers. But as people from a wider array of points of origin, including Asia, and with yet greater religious and cultural pluralism began to enter the United States, the image of the crucible or melting pot also became more challenging. So Zangwill's play, rather than being the beginning of this image, I think, is more like the end. It's a response to a decades-long crisis of assimilation, as it was perceived, and the growing sense among many Americans, particularly members of the Anglo-Protestant elite, that the American Republic could not survive without a much thicker racial and religious core than their parents and grandparents had believed. That sense was expressed in the series of immigration restriction acts that were passed at the beginning of the 20th century, in addition to other movement and legislation. But that, too, proved unsatisfactory, I think less for reasons of internal critique or opposition, but as a result of the growing threat of fascism and authoritarian nationalism in Europe. And in the 1930s, a not unprecedented, but nevertheless different understanding of America as a creedal community begins to emerge and becomes an official feature of the rhetoric of the Roosevelt administration. So Walter gave a moment ago a rather stirring and sort of powerful account of that conception of American national identity. My objection, such as it is that that speech would really only have made sense delivered sometime between about 1914 and about 1965. What we think of as the creedal or civic version of American nationalism only became central to American culture fairly recently in the first part of the 20th century. And I think that for the last 50 years, roughly, we've been living with the crisis of the creed, or the crisis of a civic nationalism, which was undermined by two structural flaws that had been with it since the very beginning. One was the issue of race. And this was pointed out most famously by the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal in his work, The American Dilemma, published in the midst of World War II. Myrdal says Americans have this problem, which is that they all agree on certain political and moral principles, but they don't know how to apply that to the presence of African Americans among them. And that crisis became that tension became too great to bear without significant revision. And I think, having mentioned King, you see this in some of the development of King's arguments and ideas. He begins his career much more creedal and much closer to this World War II mid-century consensus. He ends it much more critical and much more pessimistic about the possibility of sustaining a creedal identity. So that was one problem. The other problem was war. The phrase American creed was not invented in the 20th century, but it was popularized during World War I. It was actually the title of an essay that won an essay contest to express the principles of American nationality in the shortest possible time. So it's 100 words. And from World War I and the adoption of the creed by the Wilson administration, there's actually a bronze plaque of it in the Capitol building, which you can go and see, through the creedal rhetoric of the Wilson administration, through the adoption by Eisenhower of the civil religion of one nation under God. This vision of the American people as constituted by distinctive moral and political beliefs has always been positioned against an ideological enemy. First the Nazis, then the communists. And it worked very well for that purpose. But in the 1960s, and in particular in the wave of criticism of American foreign policy during the Vietnam War, that became much harder to sustain. So the result is not that the creedal conception of American identity has disappeared. It's clearly still with us. But it has been fraying around the edges for a very long time. And it seems to me that this crisis of national confidence involving race and war or foreign policy in the 1960s is actually a much more important source of our present discontents than more recent concerns about mass immigration or the role of the European Union or other transnational institutions.
Okay. We'll come back to I'll address some questions to both of you after Paul speaks. So Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Drew, and thank you, Sam, for your comments there. I think it falls to me to defend creedalism. After listening to Walter speak and now, Sam, your comments, I heard some I'd say implicit or maybe veiled critiques of creedalism from Professor Mead's talk. He spoke, I think, very stirringly of our need to be loyal, to have allegiance to our community and our republic. But it seemed to me that he downplayed the creedal parts of it. He actually contrasted his view with pure creedalism. He said, we don't want to define ourselves just as a creed, and we don't want to have the American government sort of impose an official ideology or suggest that we all have to have right thinking, right? That was kind of Professor Mead's critique of creedalism. And Sam, you've suggested historically that creedalism is more recent than we might think, that it's almost an invention of the early 20th century. And that there are some problems with implementing creedalism well because of race and because of war. I guess I want to maybe defend the importance of creedalism. I'm not sure I can dispute with you on historical grounds, although I'd point to things like the Gettysburg Address and say there's elements of creedalism there. So the reason they were able in the early 20th century to invent creedalism is because there was genuine antecedents, right? I think Martin Luther King Jr. would certainly have said he didn't invent the idea of living up to our creed, that we were actually fulfilling the creed that was implicit in the founding. But let me highlight what I think is the importance of creedalism, because, again, to go back to Professor Mead's talk, he emphasized our need to be loyal to our community and republic, but he left a little ambiguous how we define our community and our republic and why it was worth being loyal to. I think his implication was that we should be loyal to it because it's ours. And I'm a little unsatisfied with that. I think that we do need boundaries to define who we are and who we aren't. Walter said that we are a tribe of tribes, which is the sort of the melting pot metaphor, I think. But what holds together a tribe of tribes? Historically, it tends to be either one tribe to rule them all, a sort of form of internal imperialism, which really was the American model, the tribe of white Protestants ruling them all up until very recently. Or the alternative is to have an ethic of fairness for all, and that's where creedalism comes in. So I think that this creedalism is actually a very important check against the, I'm going to call it the cultural understanding of American identity. I think we have to emphasize and cultivate the creedal conception of American identity, because that's the only thing that can really be a bulwark against a cultural understanding of American identity. And I want to contrast these two ways of thinking of American identity, the creedal and the cultural. And I think that I think they're very distinct, and it's important to keep in mind the one and against the other. Let me try to tease them out by thinking of 4 different policy areas or realms, specific debates where we see the difference between the creedal and the cultural understanding of American identity. I think Walter was right to say so often we just are arguing about the definition of words. So I want to be as specific as possible to try to draw this contrast sharply. So let's talk about immigration. Right? I think the creedal understanding of immigration would say, yes, sometimes we can restrict immigration as necessary for national security, maybe as a component of economic policy. But the creedal understanding would look at the cultural diversity that immigration brings and generally celebrate it and welcome it as an asset, not a liability to the United States. That cultural diversity is generally a good thing. The cultural understanding of American identity makes a different argument, and you do actually see this today. I'm going to work hard to present their argument in their terms, not as a caricatured version, but I have heard the nationalist side say that we should restrict immigration to protect and preserve our demographic or cultural identity. That we Americans have a right to be who we are, our culture, our heritage, and so we can pick and choose who comes to this country. And we should be selective to choose only those who are culturally predisposed to share our liberal values. And if you want to push them to be very specific, folks like Michael Anton will explicitly say that yes, that means we should prefer either Europeans and or Christians. That those are the immigrants we want because they're predisposed to share our values. Key to this understanding of American identity is the belief that only Anglo-Protestant culture yields liberal democracy. They believe there's a necessary tie between Anglo-Protestant culture and liberal democracy. That's why they believe what they believe about immigration. I'm going to return to that at the end of my talk and explain why I think that's mistaken. Another realm where we see the difference between the creedal and the cultural understanding of American identity is in morals legislation. If any of y'all have been following the debate between Sohrab Ahmari and David French, you know where I'm going with this, right? The whole thing about Drag Queen Story Hour. I think the creedal understanding of American identity would say that we should pass laws to uphold public order, public decency, but after that, the government should sustain viewpoint neutrality and should not privilege one religion, one culture, one ideology over against anything else. And that we should allow a free marketplace of ideas. The cultural understanding of American identity says that we should pass laws explicitly to privilege, to tilt the playing field in favor of our culture, our heritage, our identity, usually understood to mean Anglo-Protestant or sometimes Western cultural norms and standards of morality. Yoram Hazony has written explicitly calling for the return of what he calls public religion that favors, as he calls it, Anglo-Protestant cultural norms. Public morality derived explicitly from the broad Judeo-Christian ethic. So they would use government power differently. Creedal says no, government doesn't have that power. And the cultural says, yes, the government does have that power to pass laws to favor one particular view of morality over against others. Third area is in how we teach American history. The creedal understanding of American identity wants to teach us about our past, specifically with reference to how we have lived up to or failed to live up to our ideals, our creed. And so that means learning about our failings, learning about our national sins, learning about slavery, about segregation, about the treatment of Native Americans. It's actually really important. For being a really patriotic American, we have to understand our mistakes to avoid making them in the future and to challenge ourselves to do better in the future. And that can require a sort of confession and repentance for the past. I think the cultural understanding of American identity tends to approach this differently. And here I want to say, this seems to me more of an attitude than an argument. But you run across the attitude that we ought to focus on our national victories and our national achievements and perhaps minimize or pass quickly over our national sins and our national failings. Think right now about the New York Times 1619 Project, where they've focused on retelling the history of the creation of the institution of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, dating to 1619, the 400th anniversary this year. 400th anniversary. And the reaction to that. I think that's a fine historical project. I actually disagree with the New York Times and their contention that that is the true founding of America. But what I want to note is that on the right, you've seen a lot of people sort of offended by the New York Times effort, as if it's somehow wrong or illegitimate to dwell on the past, to dwell on the sins of the past, and offensive to remind ourselves of our national failings and national sins. I disagree. I think it's actually very important for us to do that, again, to understand how we have failed to live up to our creed and how we can do better in the future. Fourth area, very quickly, is foreign policy. The creedal understanding of American identity understands the United States to be an exemplar of liberty, a city on a hill. When other countries follow our example, we understand that's a good thing, that we can actually trust other like-minded countries around the world, that we can cooperate with them, that we can form alliances with them, that the spread of our ideals is an asset to our security. The cultural understanding tends to view international cooperation very differently. The America First posture of the world is generally suspicious of alliances and of international cooperation. It's against this, quote, globalism, and sees international politics as a zero-sum competition between nation states, cultural blocs, for prestige and power. This is how I think we see the difference between the creedal and the cultural understanding of American identity most clearly in these four areas, and there's probably others as well. I'd welcome your thoughts on that. That's why I think it's actually very important for us to stress and emphasize and cultivate the creedal understanding of American identity so that we don't fall into the trap of the culturalist understanding or the blood and soil understanding of American identity. Let me conclude with the good news. The culturalists or the nationalists, they believe that our democracy depends on the perpetuation of Anglo-Protestant cultural norms. And I have the good news for you that that is completely untrue, that democracy does not depend on Anglo-Protestant cultural norms. The nationalist view confuses originating conditions with necessary preconditions. It is true historically that liberal democracy first arose in 18th century Protestant Britain. That does not mean you all have to be 18th century Protestant Britons to adopt democracy in the future. There are democracies all around the world today in non-Western, non-British, non-Christian cultures and societies and states, from India to Japan, to Botswana, to Kiribati and Tuvalu, and Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, and elsewhere. I could list 36 non-Western, non-Christian democracies in the world today, right now, that disprove the idea that you have to remain Anglo or Protestant to be truly liberal and democratic. That's why we can safely, with confidence, emphasize the creedal understanding of American identity with full confidence that we can perpetuate our liberal democratic cultural norms far into the future, whether or not we remain a Judeo-Christian nation. Okay. Thank you.
So we'll do a couple questions, then we'll throw to the audience if you all have questions. You both, I want to talk about kind of the moment of cultural redefinition that we're in. That seems to be, obviously sparking this conversation and a lot of the angst that's shared or expressed by a lot of the people on the conservative side, the new right, this national conservatism, all of that. Is this this sort of impending fear that, and I think you both kind of mentioned the golden time that if you're kind of maybe a Creedalist, like Sam says, or a tribal imperialist, as Paul said, like there's this time in which there's a predominant monoculture that's kind of governing over all, and that there's some unity there, and if you're a part of that kind of culture by either birth or experience or history, you look back maybe on that time as a time in which you resonated more with the culture than you do now. The culture is under a massive shift. It's under this kind of process of diversification and redefinition. And so the angst seems to be of like, well, it's not like what it used to be. Can it still be America, right? Can it still be fully throated, true, Republican freedom, liberty, kind of America that we all know? And have kind of based our history on and based a certain amount of our existential comfort in, can still be that, even though it's expressing itself in a different way. So maybe both of you talk to that. You can coin toss as to who wants to take it first. But
well, there's a number of ways to answer that. I guess the first one I'd say is you don't have a right to government validation of your cultural preferences, right? In fact, it's sort of contrary to the American creed to try to use the government that way, right? If the First Amendment means anything, it means America doesn't have an official ideology. And if you try to use government power to institute your ideology and foist it upon other people, you're kind of misunderstanding the purpose of America. And so I understand there's a lot of cultural shift that's been going on, but by the way, it always has. Like, culture always changes. And the idea that there is this mythical past when everything was just the way I liked it, and if we could just return to that, I'm sorry, but that's a myth. It's not true, and you cannot freeze frame culture. Cultural change is a fact. It's just going to happen. If you want to change it a different way, great. Form a society. Go teach a class. Go start a Big Brother program. Do something in a volunteer way in your local neighborhood to affect the cultural change you want to see in the world. Don't try to use the government to force it on the nation as a whole.
So just to push back on that, there are going to be people within the new right or national conservatism, whatever you want to call it, or just cultural conservatives that would push back and say, wait, no, okay, you can't use the government for your own, cultural preference or whatever, but that is exactly what liberalism does. That's exactly what the secular left has done, is that they have taken a secular ideology and instrumentalized government in its, proliferation, and so it's not fair. We're fighting an uphill battle against scales that are weighted against us, and the thumb on that scale is, secular liberalism, and they're using the power of the government to do that. So, I mean, how do you combat that, criticism? How would you?
That criticism of the left is correct. I agree wholeheartedly with that critique of progressivism. Nationalism and progressivism are mirror images of each other. A nationalist is just a pro-life progressive, more or less. And so I'm capable of recognizing the faults of both sides. This is what culture war is. They're both trying to take over the government and use it to impose their preferred cultural blueprint on the country. They're just doing it in very different ways for different cultural purposes. So I'm capable of saying, yep, they're both wrong, and their critique of each other is more or less correct. And I'd love it if we could return to classical liberalism of the 18th century and do what I think the founders intended for us to do.
Okay. Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul's point that nationalism and progressivism are very closely related is an important one.
Woodrow Wilson would agree, by the way.
Woodrow and so would Theodore Roosevelt. Yeah. And if we do think of these debates more historically, as I've suggested, and less conceptually, there is a very close relationship between nationalism and progressivism, and really Theodore Roosevelt's famous New Nationalism speech is the point of contact between them. I think both of those projects risk foundering on the same reality, which is that this is a big country with a lot of different kinds of people in it, and in my view, there is no plausible scenario in which large portions of that population simply shut up or go away. And we saw the danger of one version of that fantasy in the 2016 election. Remember when many Americans were informed that their lives did not reflect who we are, or they were deplorable, and they didn't like that. And I don't think anyone should blame them. But vice versa, there are large numbers of Americans who don't like being told that they're not real Americans, because in some way their lives diverge from Anglo-Protestant culture, or they are globalists or cosmopolitans. Neither group is going to disappear. So we're all in here together, and we're going to have to learn to live together. And I think the goal can't be permanent victory of a kind that just doesn't seem possible, and certainly not possible with conventional democratic means, but rather finding ways to accommodate the fact of pluralism or diversity, even though it's very uncomfortable. I mean, another way to put it is that we all like the idea, or most of us like the idea of homogeneity if we get to decide exactly on what terms
If everyone looks like
it will
us.
exist.
Yeah.
Looks like us, or looks the way we want to, not necessarily just like us. But it doesn't work that way.
Right. So I want to address a little bit of the, I guess I call it, apocalyptic egotism. Right. It's this sense in which we're increasingly divided as a country. We're divided to the point where people, according to stats and statistics, would prefer to. It's better to marry outside of your faith than someone from a different political party. Right. That there's this massive amount of kind of political division, and so if what do we gather around? Like, what is there if it is not a kind of secular, as the secular liberals would maybe put forth some kind of secular liberal identity or kind of cosmopolitan identity, if it's not going to be like, obviously due to the diversity of America, something that's like too homogeneous or too ethnic or anything like that. What for the people out there who are just living in America, and they're just they have maybe a loose association of maybe what it means to be American. They have a history. They're working in the Rust Belt, or they may be a new American, or they may be recently immigrated. Like, what joins those two together in popular culture? Because I feel like the conservative right is trying to put forth all of these different things. Let's rally around this, right? Let's rally around a new moral code. Let's rally around a new birth of some kind of religious identity in America. But with the diversity that exists, is that possible? Like, what do we rally around? Like, what can we rally around? You should have an answer, because if you don't, it's.
I mean, is the American creed not sufficient?
Okay.
Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just asking. Like, what options are there that would have a broad enough kind of appeal and could be put forth enough to gather around?
I'll put it this way. So one of the critiques I hear about creedalism is that it's a thin gruel, right? It's just it's abstract, philosophical. It does not resonate with your hearts. So I want to make sure that I say I'm not advocating for pure creedalism. It's as if that's the only thing that defines Americans. I think that what we ought to do in teaching us how to be American is, yes, the creed, but also, and this is C.S. Lewis, right? To love your country means to know the best of its past and want to participate in the future, right? So that means teaching American history and teaching us to cherish and cultivate and celebrate the best of our history. So I love all the things associated with our civic religion, monuments and memorials and parades and national days of prayer and Thanksgiving and the 4th of July. Like, that's great. I think that we should cultivate that and do not mock people who participate in those things. And I'm speaking now to the progressive left. Do not denigrate or condescend to those who enjoy that kind of Americana. That's good, and we should enjoy that and cultivate it and be proud to be American. I'm a veteran of the armed services, and I love that. I think that the presence of the armed forces in public displays of Americana is also good. I'm not worried about military parades. I think that'd be great. So cultivate the best of our past and want to participate in the future. So that communal attachment that Walter talked about, our allegiance to our community, means also an allegiance to bettering our future. So I think, so what does it mean to be American? The creed, our history, our future.
And so part of that future would be allowing people the freedom, the opportunity to maybe head in a different direction than what you would approve of, right? I mean, culturally or morally or like any of that, like.
Well, that's the great thing about the creed, is that it does not tell us what to do with our lives, right? It is a framework for contesting power peacefully. Now, if you want to contest power unpeacefully, then you're kind of not American. That's what the Confederates did, right? And in an important sense, they were not Americans, right? They actually renounced allegiance to the Constitution and waged war upon the United States. And so they have put themselves out of the community. We're no longer loyal to them or allegiance to them. And so I think it's good for us to recognize there is a boundary line that defines who we are and who we aren't. And if you come here and say, you know what, I want to be an American, but I don't like the Constitution, well, then you're missing the point of being an American. It means to have allegiance to this system, this polity, these rules, and this way of contesting power, and not another one.
It seems like, Sam, that there are people who are kind of saying that we're getting to that point, that there is a civil war coming, right? Or that there has been, even President Trump tweeted recently, some kind of, if he's removed from office, there'll be a civil war. But that there's such division in the country that it may become necessary, if you value this picture of what America used to be or what you think America should be, that you have to begin to engage outside the system. So what is the likelihood of that? What is the feasibility of that? And how much of that is existing just in the Beltway and not in, if you go out into the country and you have neighborhoods and people playing t-ball together or whatever, like how much of that is an insular DC dynamic or a New York dynamic?
Well, I live here, so it's hard for me.
Does anyone not live in New York or DC? Can we?
Hard for me to tell. I mean,
Right.
my impression is that fears of a second civil war are fortunately exaggerated, and that the reality of American life for most people in most places is far less fraught than you would think if you spend your time in Washington, maybe, or if you spend a lot of time watching cable news, certainly. But since you bring it up, I should say that especially on the right, there's really a long-standing affection for a kind of almost pornographic apocalypticism, these fantasies of takeover and violent resistance, and I think that's very unhealthy and potentially dangerous. I mean, there's a real appetite that I simply don't understand for a sort of civil conflict LARPing, which almost always is indulged in by people who think war and enmity means writing mean things on the internet. I haven't served. I don't know what battle looks like, but I'm pretty sure it looks very different to Twitter. So I think that tendency to overstate the degree of conflict and disagreement and strife is also dangerous, just as is the tendency to imagine that there is either a conservative or progressive silent majority that is ready to express itself and to banish to the margins the small number of annoying dissenters.
So you bring up an interesting point, and I want to ask kind of one last question. I'll ask kind of a Paul, and then we'll open it up. So if you have questions. You talk about the idea of words matter, basically, right? You have got enmity and war, and it obviously looks different than the social media feeds, in reality. But there's something about that in that statement, and kind of with that idea, that the meaning of words matter, and yet we live increasingly in a culture and an environment in which the meaning is divorced from reality, right? I mean, that someone can say something, they can say whatever they want, and I can't imagine who that could be, but there are individuals that will tweet things and then immediately say, I was just kidding, or it's a joke, or it's satire, or it's, and there is less and less allegiance to a kind of strict and conservative understanding that if you say war, you mean war, right? Or if you say enmity, you mean enmity, and that if you say freedom, you mean freedom. And there are, how then, Paul, do you, craft a culture? How then do you gather, if you're going to have a creed, if you're going to have, like, say, here are these words, we're going to gather around these words and say, this is what these, these words mean, we all agree to it, we all assent to it, we're all American. But then it's like, if we can't, agree, it's kind of an epistemological thing, if we can't know what we know about these words, like, then how powerful is that creed? How powerful are the words if they're divorced from reality or meaning?
Wouldn't it be great if we had a mechanism within the creed to adjudicate disputes about the creed peacefully, right? And that's exactly what the Constitution and the Declaration do. Again, it's a mechanism for the peaceful adjudication of disputes and contestation of power. And within the creed itself is a dedication to a Constitution which establishes a court system and is the Supreme Court. And so, yes, we actually have a 200-year disagreement about the meaning of liberty and equality. And we're continuing to carry on that dispute. And I'm very grateful that we can do so peacefully through an ordered system, through a system of ordered liberty. And so long as that continues, the American experiment continues. And we should continue to invest in that process so long as there's a chance for it to continue the way it is. And I understand there's an argument that it has already failed, that the system is rigged, and that usually comes from people who are not actually participating in the process in the first place.
If I may just add to that briefly, I agree with Paul, and I would say further that one of the frustrating things about these conversations is that they tend to be conducted either on the level of rhetoric or of very specific policy proposals. And they're both unsatisfying because I don't think it's just a matter of definitions or pronouncing the correct words. That's not going to heal our divisions. But also, most of these policy questions really are not fundamental questions of principle. They're matters of prudence, and they're open to negotiation and compromise. What we don't think about enough, and in this respect, I think we've neglected one of the great lessons of our founding, is thinking about institutions. What kind of institutions do we need to disagree in ways that are consistent with social peace and produce results that, if not everyone, then most of us can live with? And the constitutional architecture as it stands is a good start. But I think there are institutional fixes that could actually help us. So my hope as we continue these conversations is to think more about institutions and less about either words or either the meaning of words or fairly technical policy questions.